All right, guys, we're going to get started, and I'm going to break this into 3 separate videos, one for each of these pages. And to get to this sheet, you guys are going to go to the globe to connect to the server, and then you'll see the server here. You're going to go to Video and Animation and After Effects Enrichment, and this one is called Illustrator Tutorial. So you just want to click and drag that to your desktop folder inside of there to make a copy of it, and then launch it. Okay, so let's talk about the workspace before we get into all the tools. On the left we have what's called the toolbox. On the top right here we have the application bar, and then on the right we have these little icons that represent what are called palettes. So this is kind of nice. They have little flyouts, and then you could actually click and drag it out or click and drag it back in. If I'm ever talking about something and you don't see the palette here, you can always go to Window, and here are all the different kinds of palettes that you can have. Also notice that there's different workspaces to work through. So maybe I'm painting, maybe I'm working on layout, depending on what you're doing, you could pick a different workspace. If you're ever missing your toolbar, you could go to Window, Toolbar, and select it if it's ever missing. Also, you could go to reset the workspace, and then it will reset it back to normal. All right, so before I actually get into the tools, I wanted just to talk about navigating the workspace. If you hold down the command key on your keyboard plus the plus, it will zoom in. If you pick the command key plus the negative, then it will zoom out. And if you pick command and 0, it will fit the page onto into the screen. And then over here on the left, I wanted to point out that if you select the hand tool, I can click and drag the document around. And I could also use the zoom tool to click and drag into a particular area, which is what I'm going to do right now. So I want to focus in on my first tool, which is the selection tool. And yes, it does select, so if I select an object, there it is, it's selected. But I can also click and drag and move an object after I select it. I can select an object, and then if I hover over the upper right hand corner, it will turn into these arrows that actually have like a rotate button, little arrows, and I'm going to click and drag, and now I can rotate it. And if I hold down shift, then I can constrain how it's rotating. So that's how I got this perfect triangle. Diamond, I'm sorry. So next you probably, and I get this a lot when beginners first are starting off with Illustrator, you're probably like, what are these white dots? Now if you click and drag in, it will actually make it into a circle or a rounded rectangle. So that's something to note. So I'm going to click and drag that over here after I've rotated it. And so we have selected, rotated, and the last thing we can do with the selection tool is select and scale. And if I click and drag over the corner, I'm rescaling it. Now notice it's actually turning into more of a rectangle. If I hold shift, note that it constrains the proportions. So that's how I make a perfect square right here. Okay. I'm going to move over, and I'm going to move on to the next tool, which is right next to the selection tool, and that's called the direct selection tool. So I'm going to select that one, and what it lets me do is select the individual anchor points of a shape. So this is a closed shape with all these different anchor points, and then between each anchor point there's a path. So I'm going to click one anchor point, and we know it's selected because it's a darker blue, and then I'm going to click and drag it, and I'm going to just turn this polygon into a star. So this tool just lets me select individual anchor points and then move them around. Okay. All right, so let's move down, and I want to just go through the different options of after I select a shape. And notice that when I do select different things, my application bar changes. So I'm going to focus in on when you actually are working with shapes, all the different options you have, because you're going to be working with shapes when you're building up your monster. So this first one says to select it and then use the swatch panel in the application bar to change its color. So if I go up here to my swatch panel, here are some just default colors, okay, and I can change the color. But I also want you to note that there's a library and there's tons of colors. So for instance, I'm just going to pick one And if I hit a folder next to some colors, it will then add it to the default colors up here. And then I can pick thing, just crash. Cool. Okay. I'm back after crashing. So again, I selected here, and then we kind of work through, you know, we could pick colors. But what if a color that you want isn't here and you don't even see it in the library of colors? So I'm going to go over here to the bottom of the toolbox, and if I double click, if you know I roll over, it says fill. If I double click here, oh, it brings up this color picker, and I can pick whatever color in the whole world that can be created on this computer. Okay. Also note that there's CMYK and RGB values if you're working from a style guide and it's like you need to use this color and you're like, oh, I have the values, or even the hex color if you're working with web design. So that's how you can get like even more specified colors. While we're talking about colors, I would like to mention, if we go up to window and then color guide, maybe some of you are like traditional fine artists and you guys know what shades and tints are, or you've worked with the color wheel and notice that they actually have, you know, triad colors, and this is all based on analogous colors, monochromatic colors. So if you learned any color theory from fine arts, you can find colors associated with a specific color when you're trying to work towards a harmonized theme. All right, so let's move on to this next circle. I'm going to select it, and then right next to the swatch panel, we have the stroke color swatch panel. And when I do that and pick a color, notice that it changes the outline or the stroke of that object. Okay, moving right along on the right of the application bar, I'm going to select this next circle, and right next to it we have stroke. And notice that if I go up, it's going to increase the size of the stroke, or down, it decreases the width of the stroke. And there's also a little flyout menu. If I hit stroke here, we can actually control the stroke. Maybe if you're working with just a singular line and not a closed shape, you want to change the end caps. Maybe you want to make that stroke dashed and you want to control the gap between, you know, each dash or something like that. And maybe there's some different really weird things like, oh, maybe I want to make it an arrow or something like that. So there's a lot that you can do with the stroke with the palette that like flies out right here, this menu. Okay, I'm moving on. I'm going to select the next one, and where it says uniform, I'm just going to pick a different profile, so a different width profile, and notice that it gives it line variation, so from thin to thick to thin again. And there's some more options, so that's something that might be useful to you while you're working with making your characters. Next, I'm going to pick the one that to the right of that, and this is my brush. So notice that there's some brushes already like loaded here, but I wanted to point out that, you know, like they're so random, that there's a library, and there's even more that you can kind of just open up their library and add, you know, even more. So some of them look really funky when you actually start, you know, applying them, and then sometimes, you know, making it smaller or bigger makes it look bigger. Sometimes it doesn't help at all. All right, so there is some decorative brushes for you. We're going to move on and pick the next circle, and opacity comes from the word opaque, meaning I cannot see through or light cannot pass through the object. So right now it's at 100% opacity, but if I bring it down, it now becomes transparent, and if I click and drag over, we can see how it interacts with something else. If I pick the opacity flyout, I can change how it blends with another object. So this doesn't really look like much because we don't have much of a background, but it does kind of change how it blends with the object behind it. So I'm going to go back to normal. Okay, and I'm going to move on to the next circle and select that and go to the style. And here again, you're going to see some just basic styles. And what somebody has done here is that they've just like added a bunch of effects on each other, and you can kind of pick one and it puts all these effects on it. So there's even 3D, there's tons of crazy stuff here. But I wanted to point out that there is a library with more effects here. And I also wanted to point out when I come over to my appearance palette and select, and it's selected, notice that it's saying just it's a green fill, but it has a water paper effect on it and a feather effect on it. So I'm going to select one and just hit delete, and then pick feather and then delete, and then now we just have this like green. So it's just, you know, a shape and then somebody just added all these different effects to it. And you can come up to here. There's all the effects that you could add to it. And those are just some pre-made ones. All right, moving on to the last exercise of this first video, I can select a shape and give it a pattern. And if I go to my swatch panel and go to the library, there is patterns right here that you could add to it. And you can also download and import patterns, you know, like maybe you have like a scale or something like that to put all over your monster. So what if you pick one though and you're like, I'm not really like thrilled with the color of this pattern? You can recolor it with the Recolor artwork menu that looks like a little color wheel. I'm going to select this and I'm going to go to edit, and then we see all the colors here. And when I click and drag, I can drag it along the color wheel and kind of pick it and have a completely different color theme, and then hit OK, and now my pattern is a completely different color. I also wanted to point out that maybe you're not happy with the scale of the pattern on the object. So to change that, I'm going to right click and say transform scale. And the thing about this is that you want to make sure that you uncheck transform object. I don't want to change the scale of the object. I want to transform the scale of the pattern. So I'm going to pick preview so I can see this. I'm going to try like 25%. And then preview what that looks like. And I'm going to try like 300%. And then preview what that looks like. And for some reason, it's not changing. But that's how you kind of change the pattern size of the on the object and not the object itself. So I'm going to hit OK. And that's it for this first page. Go to the next one if you're interested in learning about making shapes with the shape tools, stacking and arranging and copying and pasting parts of your monster, and then also using Shape Builder to use kind of just basic shapes and merging them together into other ones.